Oh, hello.
What?
Why am I dressed like Karl Marx who's cosplaying H-Bomber guy? Well, let me set the scene. Earlier this year, when I posted my magnum opus about how vampires not only lend themselves to a queer reading, but also have pretty strong ties to queer topics and people, I received a comment that went along the lines of, well, actually, vampires are the upper class and the rich that just leash off the poor. And I'm not gonna discuss how reducing the vampire to this aspect and this aspect only is incredibly Western-centric and outright wrong, because this video is not about annoying comments. Except for when it is. So months later, when I finally managed to steal enough of the neighbor's Wi-Fi to download a video to nap to, my curious George-esque mind wandered to the Cthulhu video H-Bomber guy did a while ago. Mostly because I'm still thoroughly entertained by the fact that you're supposed to pronounce it as Cthulhu, since, you know, growing up with Russian as my mother tongue forever cemented it as Cthulhu in my mind. But that's beside the point. There is, however, something that sits right on the point, balancing as to not fall off. Namely, this particular segment of the video that touches on our beloved bloodsuckers.
Vampires are aristocratic, upper-class beings that live by parasitically consuming the essence of the poor workers and exploiting people using their influence, either their literal riches or their other, less tangible powers.
And it struck me, the comment that annoyed me all those months ago by how confidently it reduced an incredibly complex figure to this one reading was voicing the same sentiment. See, if I didn't have trouble falling asleep, I would have never made it to that point in the video, and I would have never connected the dots.
I've connected the two dots.
You didn't connect shit, but
I've connected them.
Now, I'm obviously not saying H-Bomber guy is to blame for such vampire takes. If that is what your mind jumps to, maybe it should actually jump to touching grass. But the Itsy Bitsy vampire segment of his video actually serves as a great starting point for an exploration of a topic that I wanted to cover for a while now. The interesting relationship between vampires and capitalism and how it has changed throughout the last 2 centuries. And also because it just gives me a reason to wear a bald cap and do really questionable Karl Marx drag.
You know, like the plan with Irish people is like, I'll keep all my emotions right here, and then one day I'll die.
Bram Stoker is definitely an interesting figure to explore, and to understand him best, we need to look at the Irish vamp lover through the lens of the 19th century, and not the 21st one. Since I cannot be asked to talk about this man any more than I already have in the aforementioned By Vampire piece, I've decided to bother an actual expert, namely Nick Groom, an academic and critically acclaimed author, with a portion of his work being focused on the historical readings of Gothic texts. Stoker's political affiliations are largely unknown. I mean, every single biography of his that I've read either skips this aspect of his life entirely or mentions certain points, like the fact that he supported the Home Rule and the fact that he was a member of the Liberal Party in passing.
You've got to remember that politics at this time was sort of much less polarized than it is today. You've got really, you've just got the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. So it's before universal suffrage and the rise of the labour movement. And, you know, before vampires, people used images of leeches when they're describing institutions, whether it's the church or the state or some sort of form of authority. So that's really what Bram Stoker is picking up on. And I'm afraid I can't help you with, you know, particular sort of political opinions. I think he was probably fairly guarded about those. I mean, he doesn't want to antagonize his readership or the audiences at the theatre.
Thus, I would posit that the best way to dissect social and political implications of Dracula is to focus on the fin du siècle atmosphere in the 19th century Britain.
The decline of the British Empire, as you mentioned, we have the rise of the New Woman, we have the art for art's sake or aesthetic movement or decadent movement, which began in France, heavily influenced by British writers, gaining prominence. We have major works of literature. There's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in the 1880s. Some people think that it's connected with the Jack the Ripper murders in London. We have Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, which is published, and also Wilde's Salome, the biblical play, which sort of has certain vampire qualities to it. Then the trial of Oscar Wilde as well. So it's a very culturally turbulent time.
It is not only the turbulent time that is to be credited for Dracula rising from the dead. At the point of the novel's publication, vampires as an allegory for those leeching off of others, or antagonists of all kinds, have been present in the literary tradition as well as the larger social consciousness for at least a century and a half. More to that, Stoker didn't actually wing it. He thoroughly researched the vampiric texts that came before.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to realise that Stoker did spend at least 7 years researching Dracula, which might explain why it's so much better than anything else that he wrote. So he took it seriously, and he did have a long sort of legacy of vampire writing to actually work with. I can give you an exclusive, I think, which is that some scholars have said that it was Bram Stoker who came up with the idea of Dracula not casting a reflection in the mirror. He actually takes that from a Guy de Maupassant story called The Aula, which was published shortly before Dracula. So there are sources for most of his aspects, and his notebooks are very interesting.
So if we turn our attention from trying to figure out how Stoker would have voted in 2024 and to the context of his work and very existence, we'll actually find that vampires in the Western tradition, and that is an important point, have indeed represented the social anxieties and the antagonism that H. Bomber Guy was talking about.
Okay, so when the very first vampire reports arrive in Britain in 1732, they are immediately seen as being a possible allegory against those in power. And the very first article, a feature article to be written about vampires in Britain, compares them with corrupt noblemen, royal parasites, and members of the aristocracy exploiting the other classes. So that's in 1732. So that's a very long time before Dracula. Throughout the 18th century, the vampire is used as a metaphor for the abuse of power, particularly in terms of politicians, traders, members of the rising middle classes, as well as the upper classes. That is evident from the very beginning of the 19th century, when vampire imagery is used, for example, in Ireland, as a way of criticising the British government. And you see that not only in Britain, but across the continent, also in the US, that there's a very strong sense that the vampire can be used in this way in writing, in newspaper articles, and also in satirical prints. So it's seen as a way of depicting in a cartoon form in the illustrations the major issues of the day, whether that's Irish Home Rule, whether it's to do with issues to do with landlords or taxes, or indeed slavery. Vampire imagery is very, very prevalent. It's difficult to underestimate how common an image the vampire was. So it would be extremely familiar to anybody who had any interest in current affairs or indeed literature. There are dozens of vampire stories published before Dracula. So it was a very recognizable aspect of cultural life. There were also very popular plays. There was a vampire craze on the stage in the 1820s, and this really carries on throughout the century. Very often farces, burlesques, pantomimes, comic plays. And in the 1880s, for example, you have Gilbert and Sullivan, the writers of light opera, doing their version, which is called Ruddy Gore. And that's draws heavily on the characteristics of the vampire in the 19th century. So Bram Stoker himself, being a man of the theatre, there's absolutely no doubt that he would have been well aware of the political uses of vampire imagery, and he makes definite use of them in his novel Dracula.
And while Marx's magnum opus was published over 30 years before Dracula, there is no indication that Bram Stoker has read the text or was even aware of it.
But whether he'd read Karl Marx, I don't know. I don't think there's any evidence that he had, and I think that it would be unlikely for somebody as busy as Bram Stoker. But on the other hand, as I say, this was a very, very common motif.
So Dracula is like an unintentionally leftist text? Once again, it's a little more complicated than that.
There's a reason Dracula was a count.
Karl Marx, being a German dude from the 19th century, was no stranger to Gothic himself. Considering his love for it, we may call him the original leftist goth girl. As noted by the Foreign Girls reviews in their take on The Capital, Gothic without Marx is like Dracula without blood. Similarly, those employing a Marxist lens often use Gothic imagery as examples or explanations of concepts. Morissette puts his experience teaching Marx to undergrad students the following way. Students cannot fully appreciate the intricacies of the manifesto of the Communist Party during a 15-minute skimming of the text prior to class. The language is dense, the arguments are sophisticated, and the early industrial era during which Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels wrote seems like ancient history to today's college students. Hence, he utilizes metaphors that can turn 19th century ramblings into something digestible for a hungover 18-year-old at their 8 a.m. philosophy class. For instance, under the rule of capital, workers in a typical Marxist reading are often compared to zombies, seeing as they are reduced to little more than their body parts or bodies as objects and exist in a system that can only run if they are metaphorically dismembered, separated from the means of production. Now, if you ask me, I personally prefer the Frankenstein metaphor. It, keeps our whole Gothic thing going. As posed by Franca Marezzi in The Dialectic of Fear, like the proletariat, the monster is denied a name and individuality. He is the Frankenstein monster. He belongs wholly to his creator, just as one can speak of a Ford worker. Like the proletariat, he is a collective, an artificial creature. He's not found in nature, but built. But what about the blood-sucking, cape-wearing individuals? Well, the notion of money being the so-called lifeblood on society can be met in many works that explain how the market functions, or is supposed to function. However, a certain bearded vampire lover would contest that. In The Capital, Marx compares capital to a vampire that relies on the living blood of labor to survive, and lives the more labor it sucks. Now, where he got the vampire analogy or the idea from remains undetermined and not exactly set in stone, but I've most often seen it be attributed to Varney the vampire, a 19th century penny dreadful, which is said to be responsible for a big part of the typical Western vampire characteristics. As Policante poses in his analysis, the only true vampire is capital. The capitalist is just as enslaved by the relationship of capitalism as is his opposite pole, the worker, albeit in a quite different manner. The true Marxian vampire is therefore not the capitalist, but capital itself. And reading the vampire figure as just a stand-in for a capitalist, as I would argue, fucks up the parallel by reducing the criticism of the whole system to a criticism of certain individuals hoarding wealth. Also, vampires are hot, capitalists are not, vampires are so in, capitalists are so out. Time and time again, he reminds us that capital, like the undead, attains life and power by consuming the energies of the living, by sucking their blood. Interestingly enough, in the new season of What We Do in the Shadows, Guillermo, after he gives up his job as a vampire familiar, takes up one in finance. And his relationship with his boss is portrayed to be incredibly similar to that in his previous line of work. I mean, he even accidentally refers to his boss as master at some point, and the vampires accompanying him at the office blend right in.
I am loving my job at Canon Capital Strategies. Every day I am greasing the filthy wheels of commerce and learning the dark arts of corporate America.
Parallels thus can be drawn between their vampirism and their vampiric urges and the possession capital imposes on people. I mean, talk about capitalism and sucking blood. Nadja does both. So everyone who is comparing vampires to capitalists and not capital itself is just wrong and doesn't understand Marx, right? Because there's no other correct way of interpreting the bloodsuckers through a leftist lens, right? The video is over, right? Foreshadowing is a literary device in which
Maybe it's time to serve Vampire Overlords.
As Nina Auerbach poses in Our Vampires Ourselves, what vampires are in any given generation is a part of what I am and what my times have become. Vampires are not just bloodsuckers. They're bloodsuckers who reflect the feelings and anxieties of their fangless contemporaries, one of which is the state of the economy. A relatively popular pop culture theory connects the rise of vampire media and a possible recession lurking around the corner. A similar coincidence exists with the summertime debut of The Lost Boys in 1987, months before Black Monday dealt a wallop to Wall Street in October. And Rice's vampire novels were originally published in the 1970s during a shaky economy. The 1994 adaptation of Interview with a Vampire that starred Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt arrived in the same year as the worldwide crisis known as the Great Bond Massacre. But let's investigate this claim with some low-quality research, and without my beard sleeping, hopefully. Okay. Let me walk you through this abomination of a graph that is supposed to show the link between our fanged broskies sucking blood and the economy, well, sucking. To get the general list of the general overviews, I've turned to the numbers for a list of vampire movies, and then went through every single one of them, only keeping the ones which have the US listed as the production country or one of the production countries. This then left me with the following squiggly line, which I then cross-referenced with a Wikipedia list of all US recessions.
That's not a reliable source.
All recessions are circled in red, except for the one that we're kind of in, or maybe not in right now. It's still debated. The green ones are vampires rising from their media graves during or after the recession. And the purple ones represent spikes in bloodsucker popularity that could have been seen as bad economical omens. So, what does this tell us? Not a lot, if I'm being honest. See, there's frankly a shit ton of dips and spikes that are unaccounted for. More to that, we also need to keep in mind that the current day production trends just latch onto anything that is popular and then suck all the blood of it until there's nothing left. For instance, if you look at the so-called Twilight era, you'd see that it sent vampire movies soaring through the sky, up to the point of meta parodies such as Vampires Suck. And this graph also does not account for the growth and crisis in the movie industry itself. So while the theory is fun and all, I wouldn't say it can be proven easily. Rather, we kind of see the opposite. I obviously need to give credit where credit is due. The think pieces talking about the vampire economy theory do point towards the fact that we should look at the resurgence and continuous rises of the undead from a more holistic perspective. You know, just like in the case of Dracula. Daily W, for one, says, especially in a post-COVID society, the concept of immortal deathlessness is alluring. Given the limping economy, frustrations with the wealthy elite, and the continual looming threat of plague, it makes sense that vampires have once again risen from their graves. Vampires aren't an omen, but rather a reflection of our current concerns and anxieties. With all of that taken into account, we need to examine Dracula closer as a text.
But the rich really are vampires, in a sense.
Dracula, despite not being a banger upon its release, is not only a vampire classic, but also a monument of fin de siècle anxieties and attitudes. I mean, there's so much to examine here, from the context of Stoker's work and his personal beliefs, to the questions of Irish independence, the so-called New Woman, and transgressive sexuality. But, you know,
we don't have time to unpack all of that!
Now, as appealing as Dracula Capitalist or Dracula Capitalism reading may seem, it doesn't really stand a chance when we examine the narrative a little closer. We've already established that Stoker was too busy repressing himself to, you know, find a spare minute to familiarize himself with the text of the Capital. But reading Marx does not necessarily a good metaphor make. So let's examine the narrative itself. As Day rightfully notes, the working class appear in the novel as they did in the political system after the franchise extension of 1884. They are represented but denied the right to express their own interests or determine their own destiny. Take, for instance, the speech characteristics that are given to the working class characters in the novel. When they appear, it's first, always for a short amount of time, and also not really contributing to defeating Dracula in any meaningful way. And second, their accents, dialects, and idioms are in stark contrast with the educated speech of the main cast. Sure, the way Van Helsing and Dracula express themselves in English differs from the way, say, Jonathan and Mina do. However, and there is a however, the specifics of their pronunciation and articulation are not represented in the text. Dracula's and Van Helsing's speech is distinct yet clear, whereas the rambling speech of working class characters is contrasted unfavorably with the concentration on fact, while their accents and idioms offend against the ideal of clarity. The main standoff happens between the Count and our anti-bloodsucker gang, or if we put it into class terms, the bourgeoisie and the supposed aristocracy. Maretti, for one, makes a compelling argument against using this label for Dracula. Count Dracula is an aristocrat only in a manner of speaking. Jonathan Harker observes with astonishment that Dracula lacks precisely what makes a man noble: servant. Dracula stoops to driving the carriage, cooking the meals, making the beds, cleaning the castle. Dracula also lacks the aristocrat's conspicuous consumption. He does not eat, he does not drink, he does not make love, he does not like showy clothes, he does not go to the theater, and he does not go hunting. He does not hold receptions and does not build stately homes. He posits instead that Dracula is a Marxian vampire, capital personified, yet with an added layer of perceived foreign threat emanating from his very existence. The dichotomy between Dracula and the rightful all-British, with one Dutchman and one American, vamp fighters runs on multiple levels simultaneously. As Coe talks about it in the novel, we can see the binary not only in the masculine-feminine aspect, but the rational and emotional, brain and blood, and digital and analog as well. In terms of its own archetypes, structures, and metaphors, that is the story of the vampire. Western civilization defends itself against Eastern superstition, bourgeois order against medieval disorder, knowledge and culture against animal impulses. Coe, Woker, Day, and Maretti trace very similar patterns in the narrative, despite utilizing different approaches and lenses. Namely, the fact that Dracula's position is that of a monopolist, the old capital that is supposedly foreign to the developed British society, and represents the distant Dark Ages. Within the novel, he's in opposition to the local bourgeois, as well as the new and digital manifestations of capitalism and the personal freedoms of the middle class. One is bound to Dracula, as to the devil, for life, no longer for a fixed period, as the classic bourgeois contract stipulated with the intention of maintaining the freedom of the contracting parties. The vampire, like Monopoly, destroys the hope that one's independence can one day be bought back. He threatens the idea of individual liberty. Hinckley, similarly, puts it the following way. Bram Stoker's Dracula is not a triumph over capitalism, merely over capitalist oppression in its oldest and most vampiric forms. Thus, while Dracula is, indeed, account for a reason, it is not as simple as the social antagonism between the everyman and the rich. The novel deals with a broad variety of topics that are intertwined and interdependent, from the decline of the British Empire and the fear of the racialized other, to, of course, the changing gender roles and the crisis faced by capitalism at the turn of the century. And obviously, different generations of vampire lovers are going to pick up on different motifs and offer different readings of the same scenes. Take, for instance, the so-called brides of Dracula and the way they prey on Jonathan.
He's giving himself up to those desires. He's acknowledging the dreadful inevitability of that, but I read that as being less to do with the sort of sexual fantasy, more to do with the recognition that you are an object about to be consumed.
Millie Williamson, on the other hand, notes that the Western vampire is a creature of capitalism. It enters the Western imagination concurrently with the emergence of the culture of the bourgeoisie, giving expression to its fears, denials, and contradictions. But that's just the 19th century vampire. During the second half of the 20th century, the bloodsucker figure undergoes some really drastic changes when it comes to literary tradition and framing, and eventually even becomes sympathetic and, I'd say, human-like. How does that factor into the whole vampire capitalism thing I've been going on and on about?
The first vampire capitalist, the first vampire pilot.
Here's the thing. Over the course of the 20th and into the beginning of the 21st century, a certain number of factors led to the vampire becoming this alluring figure that society has come to love and, more importantly, identify with. Let me just really roughly sketch it out. First, the bloodsuckers were domesticated by Western audiences and largely stripped of the exoticism that was associated with the other. Second, what the perceived other used to stand for in the Western mind, be it race, sexuality, general outsiderness, etc., became more accepted than in the previous century. And finally, those who fit the definition of the other got more of an opportunity to participate in mainstream culture and, most importantly, shape it through direct self-expression. Or, rather got an opportunity to have their art be taken a tad bit more seriously than in the 19th century. Not even to mention the rise in independent and small production and publishing.
I mean, do you think there is an otherness to the vampires and being a writer of color, a lesbian, is there something that all those things have together?
All come together because it's the outsider. It's the outsider, and one of the reasons I enjoy writing Gilda stories is because it's an outsider who finds her way to community.
And I would posit that just as the vampire figure became more familiar, capitalism has embedded itself deeper into our day-to-day lives and consciousness. As Shaviro, who goes even further in his analysis, argues, vampires today are popular commodities, probably more popular than ever, but they are not really terrifying any longer. Rather, they feed our naive hunger for a safe dose of exoticism. They are commodities that ironically embody our nostalgic yearning for a time when not everything had yet been subsumed under the commodity form. The two chapters dealing with vampires in this book entitled Neoliberal Gothic, International Gothic in the Neoliberal Age, are of particular interest to us. While talking about different aspects and installments, both Stefanu and Gens talk about the modern-day neoliberal vampire. Gens, for example, notes that under neoliberalism, the vampire endures and evolves to reflect this interplay between freedom and coercion, emancipation and subjugation, which is at the heart of the liberal regime. Whereas Stefano points to how simultaneously we identify with the fanged monster, and they also represent fears of being deprived of life and opportunity, of losing in the neoliberal game. And I'll tell you more. Not only does the vampire as a subject or a vessel for exploration of different topics becomes closer to us, but the interplay between vampires and capitalism rises to the surface of the text. And that is probably apparent in two specific vampires beloved by yours truly. First, Louis Dupont du Lac, specifically the version depicted in the new AMC Plus adaptation, and second, Gilda from the Gilda stories. Vampirism in the new adaptation of Anne Rice's work is seen as a curse by Louis, and the urge to drink blood is portrayed as inherently inhumane and exploitative, which allows us to circle back to that vampire capital metaphor from before. Louis, even before officially becoming a vampire, can be loosely classified as one, seeing as he depends on the people he leashes off and on exploiting women that work for him.
I profit off the miseries of other men and I do it easy. Drugs, liquor, women. I take daughters with no homes and I put them out on the street, Lord. And I lie to myself saying I'm giving them roof and food and dollar bills in their pocket, but I look in the mirror, I know what I am. the big man in the big house stuffing cotton in my ears so I can't hear the cry.
Louis is ushered into vampirism under the guise of transgressing the limitations society imposes on him as a queer black man. At first sure that it is possible to overcome the very structure of the society he lives in and zoned in on the personal success. At certain points of the story, he's both the leech and the one leeched off of, the hunter and the hunted, similarly to how humans navigate the neoliberal economic reality. In the present day, Louis lives in Dubai and happily turns a blind eye to the atrocities committed by the state as long as it guarantees him personal freedom. And while he is shown to be empathetic, that empathy does not extend into solidarity or egalitarianism. Even if we were to look at his current-day blood-sucking patterns, their monotonous and apathetic character is reminiscent of the nature of consumption under neoliberalism. In the new iteration of the story, Louis is a truly complex and also a truly neoliberal subject. He does represent that interplay between freedom and coercion, emancipation and subjugation that Jens talks about. The story of Gilda is quite similar, especially when it comes to transgressions of power structures and hierarchies.
People told me don't do that. Lesbians don't want to be connected to vampires. Black people don't want to be connected to vampires. And I just did it anyway because I knew there was an underlying story, moral. It was an adventure, but it's all about creating family. It's all about how we create family. It's all about what do we do when we come into the world totally powerless, and then suddenly you have power.
There is, however, a key difference between the two seemingly similar characters. In the Gilda stories, vampirism is not seen as exploitation, but as an exchange. And the idea of not just taking someone's blood, but providing something valuable in return is central to the moral code of the protagonist. As she's told in the very beginning of her vampiric journey, there are those of our kind who kill every time they go out into the night. They say they need this exhilaration in order to live this life. They're simply murderers. They have no special need. They are rabid children. In our life, we who live by sharing the lifeblood of others have no need to kill. It is through our connection with life, not death, that we live. Over the course of her eternal existence, Gilda, unlike Anne Rice's vampires, starts to identify with humans even stronger than she did before. As Gama said in a 2011 interview, the inclusion of the similarities and the interplay between capitalism and vampirism in her work has been intentional. Unfortunately, the more that capitalism subsumes our lives, the more vacant our moral center seems to become. The heroic vampires at the center of my novel have this too. It's what separates them from the average murderous, sometimes guilt-ridden vampires in literature and movies. I mean, at a certain point, the novel outright compares the life of humans to that of vampires. The city was alive with people who, during the day, were locked into their own coffins. Offices, shops, factories, each one waiting for release into the freedom of the night. I would argue that Gilda and Louis are two sides of the same coin, or rather, two sides of an exploration of the same topic.
Vampires, similarly, tend to be impactful because they reflect some true aspect of the society that was writing about them at the time.
Vampires have always been a reflection of us, and over time we've seen the figures of the vampire and the human itch closer and closer to each other, and, as I would argue, converge.
I'm just like you, I'm just like you, you're just like me, you're just like me. It's something anyone can see.
In Consuming Youth, Latham poses that we are closer than ever to our vampires when it comes to consumption. I believe that these figures metaphorically embody the libidino-political dynamics of the consumerist ethos, to which young people have been systematically habituated during the contemporary period. The vampire is literally an insatiable consumer, driven by a hunger for perpetual youth. As evident by the bloodsucker renaissance we're currently going through, the vampires are not going away anytime soon. The fanged figure is simply too complex and rich when it comes to topics that it explores. So, where do we go from here? As Panichas puts it, and insofar as Marx believed that in the continued struggle by labor against the social forces of its domination, workers have enjoyed and will continue to enjoy successes, then not only is the charge of economic exploitation well-founded, but the forces of its undoing are in motion. Or, simply put, if you feel capitalism suck the life out of you, you gotta suck back. No, wait, that didn't come out right.